Alright, so in this video I want to talk about photosynthesis and how this might connect to your projects, since that is something that you guys have indicated that you need to know a little bit more about. Um, so I guess the first thing to really do is define what photosynthesis is. You might think you know what it is, and if I asked you to tell me what it was, you might say something as simple as it's a process that plants do. Well, that's not quite good enough. So let's make sure that we frame our conversation here appropriately. So this is the process of converting light energy. Light, that's my abbreviation for energy. It's an E. Let me make that a little neater. Light energy into chemical energy. And I guess what we're really talking about is, like, typically out in the world, in nature, we'd be talking about sunlight and glucose. But that's not always the case. We can use artificial lights now. And there are different forms of chemical energy. The one that we typically talk about, the most standard thing that we talk about in photosynthesis, is glucose, although it can take on the form of other monosaccharides. So I guess I should make a note here that this is also this is not the only method of making, I'm going to throw a word in here, organic molecules from inorganic molecules. Okay? So there are a couple other processes that use different forms of energy than light energy, like chemosynthesis, which is really using chemicals and then creating sugars or chemical energy through a similar but unrelated process called chemosynthesis. But light is the source of energy for most communities, and that's something that you really need to understand, and it's through this process of photosynthesis. So I think that in order to frame this, I want to take a second to look back at something that we have already looked at. Let's see if it'll work here. That's not what I want. Alright, so that's what I want, and I'm going to see if I can move it over a little bit. Okay, so we've looked at this already in our POGL, when we learned about POGLs, but this was an energy pyramid, and really what we should note is that we know a couple extra terms, so let's add a couple notations here as far as trophic levels are concerned. So let's see if this works. That's not what I want. Sorry about that, I was having some technical difficulties, but I've got it figured out now. So we've learned about some trophic levels, or food levels. Troph means food. So think about the word autotroph and heterotroph. We've talked about these in class. So this level right here would be our autotrophs. So our first level of our food chain. And we need to make sure that we understand that the arrow always points in the direction that energy is being transferred from one trophic level to the next, not what's eating what. So the arrow is going to point from the oak trees to the caterpillars. If we had actually pointed it in the other direction like that, that would indicate that the oak tree leaves are eating the caterpillars, which is not the case. So what we need to do is make sure that we have our arrows pointing up the food chain. And remember, a food chain is an overly simplified set of relationships, whereas a food web is going to be much more accurate. Although, again, it's a model, so it has its own limitations, which you should ask me about if you don't know what they are. So these are our autotrophs, our oak tree leaves. These are our primary heterotrophs. And they are, in this model, they're completely herbivores because all they're eating are tree leaves. It's written right here. These guys are the secondary heterotrophs, and they are omnivores, although that's not clearly indicated here. because this is only showing one feeding relationship. So if you were to look at this as blue jays only eating caterpillars, then they'd actually be carnivores. But we know that blue jays are songbirds and they also eat seeds. So plant matter and animal matter make them omnivores. And then we've got our tertiary heterotrophs. Okay? So that's not really what I wanted to talk about. So I want to actually draw you to what I want to talk about. And it is what's going on in this process right here. And that is photosynthesis. So without photosynthesis, we wouldn't have the energy that we are accustomed to in our food web. And actually, if photosynthesis stopped, there wouldn't be enough energy for that level, this level, or this level, and the whole system would come crashing down. And actually, we wouldn't have life as we know it. We may not have life at all. So photosynthesis is very important. And if you remember the math on this, that there's a very small percentage. So there's a very relatively small, less than you would expect, very small percentage of energy that enters life. That enters life and is converted, therefore, through photosynthesis. Which means that if light's not absorbed, is not absorbed by the leaves, then it is reflected back and can take on several different forms of energy. For example, heat or light. So not all of it's going to be absorbed, and it is turned into these other forms of energy that you might have learned about. So I hope that makes some connections for you. But there are some questions that we should be able to talk about or answer, or even, if nothing else, pose and let you think and ponder about these. So here are my questions. How do we optimize? I'm gonna put that all in bold. How do we optimize organic molecule production? In this case, I'm really talking about glucose, organic molecule production. Another question that I have is, what happens to the inputs? Or you might have learned them as reactants. What happens to the inputs in this process of photosynthesis? And how do we know, really know, that the rate of photosynthesis is increasing? Now, if you're thinking about your aquaponics system, which I hope you are, because you should be thinking about how do we increase the rate of photosynthesis so then we can actually increase the food production in our system. And that's really, really important to think about. So I guess I'm gonna scroll down a little bit here. I'm gonna go back to my green. Actually, I'll go into a couple other colors here. So I'm gonna write the overall equation, and this is something you should know. Overall equation of photosynthesis. If you know this, you'll be able to apply this basic understanding to answer many, many complex questions. So we know that plants need water. Actually, let me do this in a different color. We know that plants need water and carbon dioxide, and they need light. But I'm going to put light over this arrow because light is not, actually make that a different color, because light is not matter, it's energy, right? So it's not used in quite the same way. So water and carbon dioxide and light are what plants need, and what they actually put out through photosynthesis is glucose plus oxygen. And you should start looking at what this molecule looks like. You should be able to draw C6H12O6, and you might want to refer to, I think it's in chapter 2, is the molecular drawing of this. It is pretty straightforward, but that's something that you will need to start to learn and recognize and be able to draw for me. And so this is the overall reaction. It's very simple and very straightforward. But when we look at it a little closer, it's a little bit more complicated. Not overly so, but a little bit more complicated. So here is here's a diagram that is of the chloroplast. I think that's important. I guess I shouldn't have to note that, but I want you to see that it's labeled up here as the chloroplast. And this is the balanced equation, right? So we've got 6 waters, 6 carbon dioxides, 12 waters, and energy, although I would have put energy over here, over the arrow. We've got glucose plus 6 oxygens and 6 waters, which is actually kind of interesting. That's not what I put on this diagram, so let's make sure we add that. So water comes out as well as goes in, and that seems kind of crazy, like why shouldn't we just cancel them out? But I think what's important to note here is that we've got 12 on this side and we've got 6 on this side. So something happens to 6 of these waters, but actually what happens is something happens to all 12 of them and 6 are created in the process. So what we have here is the chloroplast, and the chloroplast is what, I'll just do part of this, is what's green. Actually, that's not the part that's green, so let me take that out. What's actually green are these discs right here. So if I were drawing these, hint hint, draw these, if I was drawing these, I'd draw these discs in green, and just the outside of the disc is what's really green. So those discs are called thylakoids, and thylakoids are the site where it's where the green stuff is, which is actually the chlorophyll, which is the pigment that absorbs the sunlight that is required for this process. That's where the chlorophyll is located, and the reaction for the first part of photosynthesis happens here in the thylakoid membrane, or this outer region of the thylakoids. There's also this part called the stroma, which is where the second reaction happens, which we'll talk about in just a second. And it happens in this stuff, which looks clear here and might, I hope, resembles cytoplasm to you, but we'll learn more about that as we go through. There are 2 membranes, the inner and the outer, pretty straightforward. And so what we're going to do is talk about what's going on in these parts of the chloroplast. But I want to add one other note here, which is another word called granum, and plural is grana. It's Latin, and this is the stack of thylakoids. So I sometimes think of this as a thylakoid as one pancake, the granum or the grana is the stack of pancakes, and the stroma is the syrup that's on the outside of the pancakes. Really the chlorophyll is just on the edges of the pancake. So think of the pancake in 3 dimensions. Anything that you can see on the outside before you cut into it is where the chlorophyll would be. And that's what we're getting ready to talk about. So what I'm going to do is actually draw a diagram of a chloroplast, and I'm going to do my best here. So we've got our chloroplast, and then we're going to have thylakoids in stacks. And this model may be misleading in that I'm only going to draw really 2 stacks of thylakoids, but there are lots and lots of thylakoids inside of a chloroplast, and they're all over. But for this model, it's only going to be on one side. And what we're going to do is I'm going to draw, this is sunlight, but really artificial light will work as well. And we know that water is something that these plants need. That's on the left side. It's on the left side of my equation right here. So water actually comes up to the chloroplasts. Now, chloroplasts have this green pigment. So note that not all parts of plants are green, just the leaves. So these cells have specialized to have lots of chloroplasts in them so that they actually have access to the sunlight at the top of the plant. It makes no sense for plants to have chloroplasts in their roots that don't have access to sunlight. So, but this water has to come up through the root. So think to our lesson on water and water molecules and capillary action and the hydrogen bonding that's going on that causes the cohesion and adhesion to draw water up against the force of gravity. But this water is coming up the plant to the leaves where the sunlight energy is hitting the thylakoids. It's exciting the electrons in this water molecule so much so that it actually splits the water into electrons, into hydrogen ions, and oxygen. So this is an unbalanced explanation. So we're not worried about the numbers of the atoms. We're just worried about the different elements here. So that's what's going to help us keep track of things. So we could go into a balanced reaction, but I don't think that we necessarily need to. So water goes in and oxygen gas comes out. So here's the oxygen gas. It's actually coming out as a waste product. So the plants aren't really using that, at least in photosynthesis. We'll come back to that oxygen later. But it's a waste product in this process. That's not the point of the water in this process. The point of the water is what's left over. Once we remove oxygen, the element that's left over is hydrogen. And hydrogen is that very, very important molecule that is going to be used, or so not molecule, atom that's going to be used. So it actually travels on this molecule, which we don't need to worry about what it stands for other than unless you really want to. But here is that hydrogen from the water. So the hydrogen from the water is added to this molecule called NADPH, that's where the hydrogen is, and the electrons actually are added to make a molecule called ATP, which you should recognize. I'll make a little note down here that ATP is adenosine triphosphate. Triphosphate. Tri means three. So it's an adenosine molecule, which we'll learn a little bit more about later, and it's got 3 phosphates attached to it. Now so this process, what we just talked about, is actually referred to, I'm going to scroll down a little bit here, is referred to as the light-dependent reaction. I'm just going to abbreviate RXM. So the light-dependent reaction. The light-dependent reaction depends on this light. But it's not so simple as that. So sometimes it's shortened as the light reaction, or sometimes just the light-dependent reaction. But the process of water breaking here is actually referred to, and there's another term here, called photolysis. Lysis means to break, and photo means light. So light is breaking water into this oxygen and the hydrogen, and that's photolysis. That's very, very important that you understand that photolysis happens in the light-dependent reaction. It's due to the light, and it's breaking water into oxygen and this hydrogen and the electrons that are going to be used in this next process. So this next process is called the Calvin cycle. The Calvin cycle. So the Calvin cycle, I just drew it as arrows. If you take HL biology, you're going to learn a lot more about what's going on here with all of the carbons and the hydrogens and oxygens that are involved. But really what's coming here are the electrons from the ATP that came from the water, the hydrogen via the NADPH that came from the water. Now, we've only talked so far about light and water as our inputs. The one that we have not talked about is carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide is what needs to enter the equation here. So CO2 comes into the chloroplasts at the stroma. So this reaction here is in the stroma. The light-dependent reaction is happening in the thylakoid membranes. But the stroma, in the stroma, this carbon dioxide is being fixed. We call it carbon fixation by these molecules. And so when we have carbon and oxygen and hydrogen that came from the water combined in a series of processes, we end up with C6H12O6. Again, it's not balanced. We're just worrying about the atoms at this point. And we get our glucose out. But that's not the end of the process. So what the hydrogen is what was given away. So what we actually end up with is NADP plus and ADP, adenosine diphosphate, plus a lone phosphate. So the electrons that held this third phosphate to the adenosine diphosphate have been transferred over to this carbon dioxide, plus the hydrogens that were associated with NADPH to give us glucose, but then they return back to the thylakoids to get their electrons and their hydrogens from the next water molecule, and they cycle back through. So we say that this Calvin cycle is also known as the light-independent reaction. The light-independent reaction. Although it's not completely independent, because it still needs these things, the electrons and the hydrogen that came from the light-dependent reaction. And the light-dependent reaction require these molecules to be recycled from the Calvin cycle. So it's kind of like this. These NADPH and ATP molecules are like buses that are transporting components to one location, and then they have to cycle back and pick up the next bus load of kids. So so it's like it's this transport molecule that will carry things between the thylakoids and the stroma. And I see that my time is quite long here. So and there's still a little bit more I want to talk about. So I'm going to stop here and make this one video separated from the next video that goes into a little bit more big picture, and maybe more. It's probably geared more to what you need in your aquaponics. But this is some of the science of photosynthesis.